Good evening, curious minds. Tonight, we're slipping behind the velvet curtain, not to marvel at jewels or coronation gowns, but to follow a trail far more intimate. The Virgin Queen, they called her, unmarried, untouched, untouchable, but for those who stood close enough, her ladies, her healers, her maids of the chamber, there was something else. Now dim the lights. Let your imagination lean in close, because what you're about to hear is the scent of royalty when the body and the throne began to come apart. In the candlelit corridors of Hampton Court, beneath painted ceilings and walls lined with tapestries, a figure moved like a living portrait, every gesture deliberate, every step rehearsed. Her hair, flame red and immaculately styled, crowned a face as pale as alabaster. She wore gowns that swept across polished floors like waves, woven with gold thread and sewn with pearls. To the world, she was a vision of majesty, the Virgin Queen, the embodiment of divine rule. Yet beneath the velvet and the legend, there existed a reality few dared imagine, one that defied the cleanliness and virtue history would later assign to her name. Elizabeth of Meurs of England, daughter of Anne Boleyn and Henry VIII, lived under the gaze of an entire empire. From the moment she claimed the throne in 1558, she became not just a monarch, but a symbol of rebirth, resistance, and restraint. Her portraits were carefully curated to present purity and unshakable control. Her wardrobe was a fortress of modesty, her words calculated, her face painted into immobility. To her people, and even to many of her courtiers, she was something more than human, untouchable, incorruptible, ethereal. But this divine image had to be constructed, maintained, concealed. And it was within those hidden rituals, far from the courtly performances and royal decrees, that the more disturbing truths began to surface. Elizabeth lived in a world that feared the body. The Tudor era was one where the natural processes of life, sweat, digestion, illness, were shrouded in mystery and shame. Hygiene, as we understand it today, was not only misunderstood, it was actively avoided. Cleanliness was not associated with water and soap, but with symbolism, ritual, and layers. Layers of fabric, layers of scent, layers of belief. And Elizabeth was both prisoner and priestess of this strange doctrine. Her daily presentation involved a small army of attendants, the ladies of the bedchamber, sworn to silence, trained to assist without reaction. Before she even opened her eyes, preparations began. Scented gloves were laid out, her bed linens carefully smoothed to avoid disturbing the oils and powders still clinging to her skin. The queen could not be seen disheveled, not even by those tasked with preserving her illusion. When she emerged into view, she did so fully armored. A bodice laced to restrict her waist, corsets so tightly drawn that deep breaths were a luxury, skirts, farthingales, sleeves, all weighed down with embroidery and symbolism, and beneath it all, the raw, sweating human body of a woman in her 50s and later 60s whose skin bore the legacy of smallpox, lead paint, and time. The scent of roses at an orris root masked more than her presence. It concealed decay. The face that looked out from portraits was a canvas coated with Venetian ceruse, a compound of white lead and vinegar that gave her the iconic ghostly pallor. This mask was applied daily, thick and caustic, layering over skin that never truly breathed. Over time, the lid corroded her flesh, causing ulcers, discoloration, and pain, which in turn required even more paint to disguise. Her eyebrows were plucked away, and her lips painted crimson with cinnabar, another toxin, but no crack in her facade could be tolerated. Even as her skin broke, even as her teeth darkened and her hair thinned, the mask held. Paradoxically, the more she aged, the more she sought to appear eternal. Mirrors were banned from her private quarters. No one could speak of her physical changes. Maids who remarked on her declining appearance were dismissed or reassigned. Courtiers knew better than to flinch. The queen was not a woman of flesh and blood. She was England incarnate, and England could not decay. But the truth festered just beneath the surface. Her wigs, once a crown of red curls, multiplied in number, each thicker than the last, concealing bald patches and fragile scalp. Her gowns, symbols of wealth and status, were never washed, merely aired and dusted, steeped in perfumes that became more pungent with time. Her linens absorbed sweat, ointments, and powders, but even they were changed only sparingly. It was believed that too much washing, even of clothes, could release unhealthy vapors. What remained hidden beneath all this fabric and formality was a body subject to the same indignities as any other, a body that aged, that ached, that reacted to the harsh chemicals forced upon it. And yet, Elizabeth refused to surrender to this truth. To do so would have been to admit that the myth was just that, a myth. So she pressed on. Day after day, year after year, she donned the costume, applied the mask, rehearsed the script. Her court followed suit, participating in a shared illusion. To question it was to risk banishment. To speak it aloud was unthinkable. And the public, the subjects who glimpsed her only in procession or portrait, believed. They saw the surface, not the skin. They worshipped the symbol, not the suffering. But now, centuries later, with the veil lifted and the perfume faded, we are left to ask, what lay beneath that icon of virtue? What did the queen see in her own reflection, if she ever dared to look? Behind the grandeur, beneath the lace and lead, there was a woman bound by ritual, obsessed with control, terrified of exposure, a woman who built an empire around her image, even as her own body betrayed it. And as we step closer, we begin to sense that the most intimate truth of all was not her power, but how far she went to hide the reality of her own humanity. What comes next peels back the layers even further, because once you understand the fear behind the powder, you begin to see how deeply that fear shaped everything, from her daily routine to the empire she ruled. And nothing reveals that more clearly than her relationship with water. She was England's beacon, radiant, commanding, invulnerable. And yet, for all the opulence that enveloped her, Elizabeth of Fitzoon lived in a world where water was not an agent of purity, but a feared and misunderstood element. In a time when science was fragile and superstition flourished, water was seen not as cleansing, but as dangerously invasive. The very act of submerging one's body in it was thought to open the skin to unseen poisons, wicked airs, and sicknesses that entered through the pores like invisible snakes. Elizabeth, sharp-witted and politically astute, was no fool, but she too was shaped by the wisdom of her age. That wisdom whispered that water could kill, and so instead of lathering with soap or soaking in a bath, she turned to a far more elegant arsenal, aroma. Perfume was not a luxury. It was a necessity, a defense, a ritual. Scents were power. They cloaked the body in illusion, soothed the senses, and in some strange way silenced the truth. Elizabeth's chambers were a theater of fragrance. Her gloves, stitched from the finest Spanish leather, were soaked in violet essence. Her gowns were stored with lavender sachets and cedar wood shavings. Her skin, what little of it was exposed, was dabbed with rose oil, orange blossom, musk. Daily, she was surrounded by a carefully orchestrated cloud of scent. Her ladies mixed floral distillates in ornate glass vessels, creating potions of such potency that the air in her dressing room hung heavy with perfume. Even the floors were swept with herbs. Rushes, long grasses spread underfoot in castles, were sprinkled with rosemary, mint, and meadowsweet to mask the odors that clung to stone, fabric, and flesh alike. For the queen, cleanliness came in the form of wiping, not washing. Cloths dampened with alcohol or vinegar were used to rub the skin, sometimes soaked with floral waters to leave behind a trace of freshness. But true bathing in the modern sense was rare, reserved for moments of dire necessity or symbolic preparation. Rumors among her maids whispered that she may have submitted to a full bath once a month, though never immersed fully. More often, it was her feet or hands that saw the basin, not her entire body. Even this was seen as progressive. Many nobles bathed even less. The idea of stripping bare and entering a tub of water was fraught with fear. The medieval bathhouses of earlier centuries had been shuttered across Europe, not just for their associations with vice, but because of outbreaks of plague. Public bathing, once considered civilized, had become a harbinger of disease. And though Elizabeth lived in the age of the Renaissance, its knowledge had not yet penetrated the world of bodily care. Instead, she bathed in symbols. The scent of frankincense in her chapel, the perfumed handkerchief she held beneath her nose in court, the layers of silk and velvet imbued with floral essences. These were her shields. They created distance between her and the earthy realities of the body, between her and others, between her and herself. The irony was sharp. A queen so elevated above her people relied on the same desperate tricks as the humblest servant to hide the human truth. The difference was only in the materials. Where peasants used wood ash and riverbank herbs, Elizabeth used imported spices and ambergris from Wales. But the aim was the same: to control what the world smelled and therefore believed. To be royal in the 16th century was to be seen, not touched, and scent was a way of projecting health and wealth and dominance. A person who smelled pleasant, it was thought, could not be sick, even if their body told a different story. Elizabeth's court was full of those whose flesh festered beneath perfume, yet whose outward air was one of perfection. To smell sweet was to suggest divine favor, and Elizabeth, ever the master of theater, ensured that her aroma did not disappoint. Still, questions lingered. Whispers passed through corridors about the state of her skin, the texture of her breath, the scent left behind in her bedchambers. No one dared confirm the truth, but everyone had their guesses. After all, fragrance may cover, but it does not cleanse. Over time, it mingles with the very thing it tries to conceal, and the queen's reliance on heavy scents hinted at more than just preference. It hinted at necessity. In private, the queen may have pondered this herself. She was known to ask about new perfumes from Italy, new distillation methods, new ways to preserve freshness. It suggests that she was aware, keenly, perhaps painfully, of the limits of her fragrant armor. She knew the illusion was fragile. She reinforced it daily. But there is no record of the last time Elizabeth Kriegskill bathed, no moment in history when water touched her body without fear, no document, no diary, no confession. All we have is the echo of a question. When did the Virgin Queen last feel clean? That answer, if it ever existed, was buried with her, beneath the silk, the pearls, the painted mask, and the centuries of carefully crafted myth. What we do know is this. For Elizabeth, scent was not about luxury. It was about survival. And when even that began to falter, her greatest fear crept closer, not that her enemies would invade, but that her own body would betray the image she had spent a lifetime perfecting. In the next breath of her story, we will look not at perfume, but at fear, not what she added to her body, but what she refused to let near it, because the absence of water in her world was not simply a choice, it was a philosophy. And to understand Elizabeth, we must ascend into the very roots of that fear. It's easy, from the vantage point of modern comfort, to scoff at a world that feared water, to imagine a queen surrounded by crystal basins and gold-rimmed jugs, yet refusing to bathe, feels like a contradiction too absurd to be true. But Elizabeth I's world was shaped not by luxury, but by centuries of superstition, inherited trauma, and a fragile understanding of health that turned even the most basic elements, wind, moisture, warmth, into suspected threats. The fear of water was not a quirk, it was doctrine. Centuries before Elizabeth's reign, bathing had been common. Roman bathhouses, medieval stews, and communal washhouses had dotted towns across Europe. Cleanliness had, for a time, been equated with virtue, but then came the plagues, waves of pestilence that reduced cities to graveyards. As the Black Death swept through streets and palaces alike, people searched for causes, for patterns, for something to blame, and they found it not in rats or fleas, those would come later, but in moisture. Moisture was dangerous. It opened the pores, it softened the skin, it left the body exposed, vulnerable, tender. Physicians of the day, still clinging to the ancient Greek theory of humors, believed that disease entered through imbalance, particularly through openings in the skin or changes in bodily vapors. Warm baths, they thought, expanded the pores, allowing invisible poisons to slip in, unseen and unstoppable. Cold water, on the other hand, was said to shock the body into weakness. The solution? Avoid both. Even educated men, royal doctors, court philosophers, echoed this belief. They advised limiting exposure to water, avoiding sudden changes in temperature, and never, under any circumstances, allowing wet hair or skin to meet a breeze. A simple draft could, in their minds, be a death sentence. So bathing became not just unfashionable, but actively feared. The closure of public bathhouses, first for their association with immorality, later for hygiene concerns, left private washing as the only option. And even then, it was done with caution, with limitations. A foot bath, perhaps, a wipe with a damp cloth, a rinse of the hands, but never a full immersion. Never the indulgent soak we imagine when we think of royal luxury. Elizabeth's court inherited these beliefs. Her physicians would have warned her against frequent bathing, citing the illnesses of past kings, who had indulged too often in the Roman style. Her ladies, raised with the same caution, would have been taught to avoid wetting the skin more than was strictly necessary. And Elizabeth herself, so concerned with longevity, reputation, and control, adopted these ideas with unflinching discipline. She knew what happened to those who let their guard down. She'd seen it as a child, relatives taken suddenly by illness, courtiers struck by fevers no one could explain. She grew up in a world where decay could come overnight, where cleanliness was not a virtue, but a gamble. Her mother, Anne Boleyn, had fallen not to illness, but to politics, but the lessons of instability and loss had been learned all the same. The body, she understood, was not to be trusted. This fear shaped her routines. The queen preferred to stay warm, to be wrapped in many layers, even in mild weather. Her chambers were filled with hangings and tapestries to trap air and block drafts. Windows remained closed. Water, if present, was warmed, scented, and carefully rationed. It was never poured freely. The image of a steaming tub in a golden palace may appear in paintings or films, but in Elizabeth's life, it was as foreign as a jet engine. Her habits were often cited as peculiar by foreign visitors, though few dared put their observations into official record. What they saw, they knew, was not unique to her, but emblematic of an entire worldview, a Europe still in the grip of medical darkness, grasping for certainty in a storm of invisible threats. And so, Elizabeth lived dry skin, dry air, dry surroundings. Cleanliness was achieved through covering, not cleansing. The fewer parts of the body exposed to the air, the safer one remained. Dirt could be brushed away, perfume could be added, but water was too wild, too risky. And for a woman whose entire power rested on control, on the perfect balance between myth and reality, that was a risk she would never take. She may have yearned in quiet moments for the relief of a bath, the soothing warmth, the weightlessness, the silence of water against skin. But longing had no place in her world. Routine ruled, fear governed, and habits, once forged in youth and reinforced by generations of warning, are not easily undone. This fear, though strange to us now, had a logic. In an age without microscopes or germ theory, experience was king, and the experience of those who bathed too often, or at the wrong time, had often ended in sickness. That was enough. Even queens weren't exempt from such lessons. In truth, the greatest enemy Elizabeth faced may not have been Spain or treason, but her own mortality. Every ache, every blemish, every fever was a reminder that her body, however perfumed and powdered, was still a body, and water, that ancient source of life, was in her world the harbinger of death. But if water was forbidden, how did she care for herself? How did she manage the needs of a living, breathing, aging human body without ever allowing it to be truly cleansed? The answer lies in substitutes, rituals, and remedies meant to replace what water could no longer provide. In the next breath of her story, we descend into the strange logic of substitution and how the illusion of cleanliness was maintained through fabric, fragrance, and relentless ritual. Behind the golden curtains of the Queen's private chambers, past the layers of protocol and ceremony, was a space few were ever permitted to enter, the domain of Elizabeth the woman, not Elizabeth the sovereign. It was here, in the intimate silence of early morning, or long after midnight, that the closest approximation to bathing took place. And even then, it was not what we might picture. There were no steaming tubs, no ivory soap, no cascading water echoing off marble walls. There was a basin, perhaps warmed by the fire, a linen cloth, a pitcher, and the cautious hands of a sworn attendant. Elizabeth of Valence, ruler of one of the most powerful nations on earth, likely washed her body no more than once every several weeks, and even that was a controlled, fragmented ritual. The idea of a full bath, where one submerged in water from head to toe, was as foreign to her routine as flight. Her baths, if they could be called that, were partial, methodical, and supervised. Only trusted ladies-in-waiting, usually the same select few, were allowed to assist, and even they were trained to look without looking, to speak only when spoken to erase their presence from the room like shadows on the wall. The process began with preparation. The chamber had to be made warm, often with braziers brought in to push back the damp chill of English air. The floor was covered in rushes and herbs, chosen for their scent and symbolism: rosemary for remembrance, lavender for calm, and thyme for courage. A copper or pewter basin was set up, and hot water, boiled elsewhere and carried in covered jugs, was poured cautiously. Into this water might go rose petals, citrus peel, or vinegar, not for skin benefit, but to purify the liquid itself. In their world, even the water needed protection from unseen forces. Elizabeth would not undress fully. Modesty, even in the presence of her most trusted attendants, was paramount. Instead, the ritual began with the feet. She would sit, clothed in a linen shift, as her lower legs were gently cleansed, more often wiped than soaked. The cloths used were fine, sometimes infused with herbs or oils. The same method was used for her hands and arms. Occasionally, her back and neck might be touched with warmed cloths, particularly if she had been ill or if the weather had been severe. But her torso, especially her chest and stomach, was almost never exposed, not even to those closest to her. And then there was the face, the most public part of her and the most guarded. Removing her makeup was a delicate operation involving gentle scrubbing with oil-soaked linen. The white lead and vermilion pigments had to be peeled away like armor. Beneath it, her skin bore the marks of time and chemicals, dry patches, rawness, perhaps even open sores. Once cleansed, it was immediately powdered again, even if she wasn't expected in court. Her face, after all, was never allowed to be entirely naked. These partial baths, sometimes referred to as washing days, were often scheduled after moments of ceremony or travel, when the Queen's exposure to crowds, stress, or outdoor air demanded a symbolic refresh. But they were rare, never spontaneous, and always arranged in advance. The preparation and aftermath often took longer than the washing itself. Once complete, the Queen would be redressed layer by layer: chemise, corset, petticoats, sleeves, skirts, bodice, until the illusion of perfection was restored. And what of the rest of her body in the days, sometimes weeks, between such washings? That task fell to a system of substitution, the constant rotation of linen shifts and underclothes. Elizabeth changed her undergarments more frequently than she bathed. A fresh shift was believed to absorb oils and dirt, effectively drawing out impurities. It was the prevailing belief that the act of removing dirty linen was akin to cleansing the skin itself. In this way, clothing became both barrier and sponge, the layer that touched the body, caught its scent, bore its burden, and was then taken away like a sacrificial offering. These garments were laundered carefully and rarely, not scrubbed, but soaked in herbs, rinsed with lye, and aired in the sun. They were expensive, precious, and their maintenance was itself a ceremony. Even the act of removing a soiled shift was layered with symbolism. It meant renewal, it meant discipline, and in Elizabeth's case, it meant control. Perfumed waters were also used for freshening up. A few drops of rosewater or orange blossom on a cloth might be dabbed along the neck, behind the ears, or between the breasts. Sometimes, fragrant pastes were rubbed into the skin, leaving behind a waxy film that masked natural oils. Powder, both scented and unscented, was applied under the arms and along the chest to soak up moisture. It was a strange blend of ritual and practicality, a choreography of half measures that somehow had become a full routine. But despite these efforts, the body remained what it was, human. And humans sweat. They age. Their skin reacts. Their scent intensifies. The queen, despite all her trappings, was no exception. Those close to her knew. They could smell the fatigue, the layered perfumes fighting beneath the silk. They could see the flush of heat beneath the powdered cheeks, the trembling hands that held the scented handkerchief a little too long. Still, no one spoke. To mention it would be treason, not just against the queen, but against the illusion she embodied. And so the cycle repeated. Minimal washing, frequent linen changes, layered fragrances, and silence. The queen remained a polished icon in public, but in the privacy of her chamber, the effort to maintain that image consumed hours, servants, and secrecy. And as her reign stretched on, and the physical toll of age grew sharper, one question loomed in the shadows. How would she maintain this routine when her body could no longer comply? That question would become more pressing with time. But for now, Elizabeth's war with the natural functions of her body continued. A war not fought with water and soap, but with cloth, oil, and willpower. And in the next breath of her story, we will descend deeper still into the cloth that served as her second skin, the linen that replaced the touch of water, and the belief that cleanliness could be worn rather than earned. Beneath the velvet gowns, beneath the brocade bodices and the stiffened ruffs, the true battle for Elizabeth's illusion of purity was fought, not with water or ointment, but with linen. To the Tudor mind, cleanliness wasn't achieved through scrubbing, but through absorption. A queen didn't cleanse her skin. She let fine fabric do it for her. And for Elizabeth I, her shifts, the plain white garments worn directly against the body, became her secret shield against the messiness of being human. Every morning the ritual began. Before her hair was dressed, before the layers of courtly splendor were piled on, Elizabeth would slip into a fresh linen shift. It was long, simple, and sacred, a whisper of fabric whose purpose was both practical and symbolic. The shift was believed to draw out impurities from the skin, collecting oils, sweat, and even bad humors that might otherwise cause illness. The dirt didn't disappear, it transferred. And when the queen removed her shift, she believed she was also removing what her era considered internal contamination. She had dozens, perhaps hundreds, of these shifts, custom stitched by hand, made of the finest materials England could offer. They were embroidered with royal insignias, personalized patterns, sometimes even edged with lace. But they weren't status symbols, they were armor. And like armor, they bore the cost of war. After a day beneath her heavy gowns, pressed against skin powdered with lead and oil, the shifts were often soaked with sweat, makeup residue, and the strange, sweet tang of perfume beginning to sour. Changing them frequently, even daily, was essential, but not just for hygiene. The very act of changing linen was a ritualized form of purification. Servants handled the soiled garments with care. They were never scrubbed like common laundry. Instead, they were soaked in herb-infused water, gently rinsed, and dried in open air. Laundresses tasked with their upkeep were sworn to silence. They worked in separate quarters. They didn't gossip, because within those folded layers was proof, not of filth, but of flesh, the queen's humanity. Yet under the layers of fresh linen, her body told a different story. Elizabeth's clothing was a trap, elegant, majestic, suffocating. A corset pulled tight across her ribs limited airflow to her skin. Petticoats trapped heat against her legs and torso. Her arms, bound in sleeves so stiff they could stand on their own, rarely felt the sun or breeze. Every layer was another inch of distance between her and the world, and between her and the possibility of breath. Skin, denied air and freedom, suffers. Trapped sweat creates moisture that feeds bacteria. Friction causes irritation. And in Elizabeth's case, there was another enemy, her own makeup. The Queen's face, the face of coins, portraits, and legend, was never seen without its mask. That mask was made of Venetian ceruse, a deadly mixture of white lead and vinegar, considered the gold standard of Elizabethan beauty. It gave her that signature alabaster glow, that cold perfection seen in every court painting. But beneath it, her skin fought to breathe. Ceruse did more than just cover imperfections. It created them. Over time, the compound sank into the skin, blocking pores and poisoning the tissue beneath. What began as a cosmetic layer became a crust, and what lay beneath it became increasingly inflamed, fragile, discolored. The body tried to heal, but the Queen would never let it. To appear in public without her mask would have been to shatter the illusion she'd built for decades. So she layered it thicker, and then thicker still. Small blemishes became lesions. Redness was painted over. Swelling was flattened with pressure and powder. Servants tasked with applying her makeup did so carefully, avoiding the worst areas, blending cracks with more lead. Over time, even they began to notice the cost. Her skin, they whispered, had begun to rot, not with visible decay, but with the slow, festering damage caused by repeated exposure to toxic metal. And yet Elizabeth did not stop. She couldn't. Her face had become her brand. It was the Virgin Queen, the ageless sovereign, the unshaken symbol of unity in a fractured land. Any break in that mask would be a break in power. If her enemies sensed weakness, they would act. If her subjects saw her as mortal, they might question her divine right. So she kept painting. She kept layering. To mask the damage, she began using patches, tiny pieces of silk or velvet, sometimes shaped like moons or stars, affixed to her cheeks and temples. These beauty spots were fashionable among nobles, but in Elizabeth's case, they were more than decor. They were camouflage. They covered wounds that refused to close, abscesses that leaked, scars that glared through powder. Her face became a battlefield, dressed in artifice and silent pain. Only the most trusted attendants saw her unpainted, even then, only in flickering candlelight. They did not speak of it, they dared not. To mention the wounds would be to acknowledge her vulnerability, and that was forbidden. Still, her people believed in the illusion. The queen on horseback, the queen at court, the queen in the portraits. She remained unblemished. No sweat stained her gown, no mark discolored her cheek. Her scent, her skin, her movement, all choreographed, and the linen shifts that clung to her body became the unseen scaffolding for this performance. But what of the cost? What happened when skin suffocated, when wounds could no longer be hidden, when perfume turned rancid in the folds of silk? That question leads us deeper still into the heart of royal cosmetics, the dangerous allure of alchemy, and the silent pain of a woman who ruled an empire behind a veil of powder and cloth. What was meant to preserve her image began piece by piece to destroy the very body it adorned. And yet, she never stopped, because to stop would be to reveal the truth. And Elizabeth had built a kingdom on keeping that truth just out of reach. It was winter, the year the 1562, when the Queen of England vanished behind closed doors. The court grew quiet. Messages were whispered instead of proclaimed. Candles burned in her chambers long after midnight. And outside, a nation held its breath, because Elizabeth was not just ill. She was near the end. Smallpox had come to the palace. The disease was unforgiving. It spread through the air, entered the lungs, and lit the skin on fire from within. Elizabeth's physicians, terrified and largely powerless, resorted to what little they knew: prayers, herbs, and ancient concoctions drawn from the dusty shelves of pre-Renaissance medicine. Among them was a favorite of the time, mercury. Yes, mercury, quicksilver, a substance as alluring as it was lethal. To the Tudor mind, mercury wasn't poison. It was a purifier, an alchemical cure believed to draw out illness, to balance the humors, to cleanse the blood. For Elizabeth, desperate and bedridden, the logic seemed sound. Her body burned with fever. Her skin blistered. Her breath came shallow and hoarse. They rubbed mercury paste onto her wounds. They infused her potions with it. They likely bathed her face in cloths soaked with it, believing they were saving her. She survived. But her skin never did. When Elizabeth finally emerged from her convalescence, her courtiers cheered, her people celebrated. The queen was alive. The throne was safe. But behind the ruff, behind the crown, her face had changed. Smallpox had carved its memory into her flesh, pitting her cheeks, marring her smooth forehead, thickening the texture of her skin. And the mercury, while praised for its healing power, had left deeper wounds. Her complexion, once naturally fair and soft, had turned waxy, sensitive, uneven. She was in her late 20s, a sovereign in the prime of her youth, and suddenly burdened with the face of someone who had walked through fire. For Elizabeth, whose image was her instrument of rule, it was unthinkable. She turned to her alchemists, her apothecaries, her trusted ladies. She demanded concealment, not only of the scars, but of the very memory of the illness. Her makeup routine intensified. Ceruse returned in thicker layers. Red pigments deepened to distract from the blotches. And quietly, beneath the makeup and perfumes, mercury remained. It became part of her beauty arsenal, hidden in salves, ointments, and facial tonics marketed as skin restoratives. Mercury softened the skin, brightened it, made it smoother, or so it seemed at first. But with each application, it sank deeper, disrupting nerves, corroding tissue, exhausting the body from within. The tremors came later, the fatigue, the mood swings, symptoms that could be explained away by age, by the burdens of rule. But the true cause? Hidden in the creams and vials lining her dressing table. And yet no one spoke, because to speak would be treason, not just against the queen, but against the very myth of beauty she upheld. Elizabeth had become more than a monarch. She was an emblem of power, grace, and control. Her face was not merely skin. It was a mask that held the kingdom together. To suggest it was crumbling was to suggest the monarchy itself could crack. So her inner circle maintained the illusion. Her attendants continued applying the dangerous balms. They painted over new sores as old ones failed to heal. They blamed drafts, food, stress, anything but the truth. Outside her chambers, rumors swirled. Visitors noticed that her face seemed stiff, her voice occasionally strained. They observed how her portraits became more stylized, less lifelike. They did not realize they were watching a woman losing the right to her own reflection. The queen, too, knew. She felt the change in her body, the way her limbs tingled, the heaviness in her joints, the nights when sleep refused to come. But she could not stop. She had seen what pity did to rulers. She had seen how quickly admiration could turn to fear, fear to disdain. If the image faltered, the empire would follow. So she painted, powdered, perfumed, and pressed forward. In moments of solitude, perhaps, she wondered what her face might have been had the illness never come, or if she'd allowed the scars to show. But there was no place for scars in her world, no space for blemishes, no tolerance for weakness. Even in pain, she was expected to appear radiant, even when dying, divine. And so the riddle remained. How do you preserve beauty when the very tools of beauty are destroying you? No one had the courage to answer her. No one dared whisper that the cure had become the curse. In the next unfolding of this story, we enter a more hidden layer still, the secret behind the hair that crowned her image, the flame-red halo that defined her portraits. Because as her face slowly surrendered to toxins and time, so too did her hair begin to vanish, and with it, another piece of the illusion she fought so desperately to maintain. In every royal portrait, Elizabeth's hair is the same, a glorious, fiery crown of copper-red curls, coiled and fanned with perfect symmetry, untouched by time. It blazes from beneath her jeweled coronets, frames her powdered face like a halo, and reinforces the image of a sovereign who is not aging, not weakening, not dying, only reigning. But behind that splendid mirage, beneath the lace-edged wigs and pearl-studded nets, lay a secret so closely guarded that even her closest attendants treated it with wordless reverence. Elizabeth had no hair, or more precisely, she had almost none left. When she was young, her natural hair was indeed a vivid auburn, inherited from her mother, Anne Boleyn. It was thick, wavy, and unmistakably regal. Foreign dignitaries described it in letters. Poets praised it in verse. But youth is generous, and history is unkind to bodies trapped beneath weight and performance. The first blow came not from time, but from paint, lead-based ceruse, the very same toxic foundation she relied on to disguise the damage of smallpox. Applied daily and never fully removed, the compound did more than scar her face. It seeped downward along the scalp, collecting at the roots, drying out the follicles until they cracked and gave up. Each hair was slowly strangled at its base, weakened by years of chemical assault. Then came the mercury. Initially used to treat the pockmarks on her face, mercury was later included in elixirs to maintain smooth skin and balance the humors. Some were rubbed directly into the scalp to stimulate growth or combat lice. The queen's physicians, like most of their time, believed mercury to be purifying, unaware of its insidious neurotoxic effects. With prolonged use, it thinned the blood, damaged the nerves, and destroyed tissue beneath the skin's surface. Add to that the crushing pressure of rule. The chronic anxiety of holding together a fragile Protestant state, of warding off assassination attempts, of outmaneuvering Spanish ships and Catholic plots, these were not minor worries. They were relentless, and they left their imprint on her body as surely as any toxin. Modern medicine recognizes what Tudor minds could not. Stress is a killer, and one of its earliest victims is hair. Elizabeth began to lose hers by the handful, first at the temples, then across the crown. Her attendants brushed more gently, trying to preserve what remained. They started pinning ribbons to nets rather than roots. But the loss continued. By her late 30s, she was already reliant on hair pieces. By her mid-40s, wigs were standard. By her 50s, even the whisper of her natural hair had vanished. And yet, no one ever said a word. It became an unspoken rule of court life. The queen's hair was not discussed. The wigs were treated as natural, their brilliance never questioned. When a new one was introduced, a style with tighter curls or more volume, it was complimented as if it had grown from her own scalp. No one flinched when she adjusted it. No one mentioned the dark stain it left on her linen when the inner padding absorbed sweat and pigment. The wigs themselves became masterpieces, crafted from the hair of servants, imported from Venice or Flanders, dyed to match the iconic Tudor red. They were stiffened with wire and wax, adorned with strings of pearls, small cameos, even tiny feathers or lace. They added height and grandeur to her silhouette, drawing the eye away from the ravages beneath. They became part of the costume of power, as essential as the orb, the scepter, or the throne. But under that sculpted magnificence, there was something else entirely. Descriptions from rare, guarded sources suggest that Elizabeth's scalp was mottled and pale, perhaps inflamed from years of metal exposure, perhaps scarred from smallpox and traction. Her natural eyebrows, once elegantly arched, had thinned to near invisibility, replaced by careful strokes of charcoal or coal. Any remaining strands of hair were plucked, shaved, or hidden beneath silk caps. What remained was not a head of royal hair, but a landscape of survival. And still, she never surrendered the illusion. She maintained dozens of wigs in her personal inventory, each for a different mood, a different event, a different dress. When visiting dignitaries came to court, they never saw the bare head of a woman in her 60s. They saw the flame-haired virgin queen, untouched by age or fatigue, and they believed, because they needed to. The illusion was more than personal. It was political. Elizabeth's body was England. To admit its weakness was to suggest the nation itself might crumble, and so she wore her wigs not as vanity, but as armor, elaborate, perfumed, and weighty. Some say that near the end of her life, she even slept in them, that she refused to let her attendants see her unadorned, even in her most fragile moments. that the mirror had become an enemy, that behind the final curtain, beneath the final lace, Elizabeth was alone, not just in rule, but in reality. But no one questioned the wigs. No one asked what lay beneath them, not because they didn't wonder, but because they already knew. And in the next chapter of her hidden truths, we turn to something even harder to disguise than a bare scalp, the Queen's teeth. For all her effort to mask the decay of skin and hair, there was one part of her body that could not be powdered, painted, or perfumed away. And when Elizabeth opened her mouth to speak, another secret slipped out, one that no amount of royalty could hide. When Elizabeth I opened her mouth to speak, whether to command, to charm, or to scold, it wasn't always her words that left the deepest impression. It was what surrounded them. In an age when even the most powerful sovereigns were prisoners of their own biology, the Queen's teeth became both a legend and a warning. Dark, damaged, and in some cases visibly decaying, they were the one feature she could never fully disguise. Yet paradoxically, they also became part of the fashion, a strange and almost tragic symbol of luxury, excess, and untouchable status. The truth of Elizabeth's dental state has long been tangled in myth. Some say her teeth were entirely black by the end of her life. Others whisper they had rotted to the point of causing her visible pain, of slurring her speech, of altering her diet entirely. What we do know is this: the Queen's teeth suffered greatly, and not because of neglect, but because of the very culture that surrounded her. In Elizabethan England, dental hygiene was primitive at best. Toothbrushes existed in the loosest form, often sticks rubbed with cloth, dipped in salt, vinegar, or ashes. There was no concept of flossing, no understanding of bacteria, and no routine of morning and evening care. Even among the nobility, tooth cleaning was more cosmetic than preventative. The goal was not health, but fresh breath, often masked with cloves or mint, and the illusion of whiteness, achieved temporarily with abrasives that stripped enamel bare. Elizabeth had access to the best dental care of her time, which tragically meant very little. Her physicians and apothecaries offered tinctures to numb pain, poultices to reduce swelling, and crude scrapers to remove plaque. When teeth became too painful or too loose, they were extracted, sometimes without anesthetic, sometimes by barber surgeons who specialized in bloodletting and bone cracking rather than healing. Recovery was long, infection was common, and the Queen, despite all her power, was not immune. But her real undoing was not poor hygiene. It was sugar. By the mid-1500s, sugar had become the greatest delicacy in England, a luxury so prized that it was displayed in sculptures, dyed into vibrant hues, and molded into edible art at banquets. Elizabeth, like most monarchs, had an insatiable taste for it. She favored candied violets, marzipan, and preserved fruits soaked in syrup. She sipped sweetened wines, ate sugar-coated almonds, and indulged in cakes thick with honey and spice. To eat sugar was to display wealth. To serve it at court was to proclaim superiority, and those who consumed it regularly developed darkened, decayed teeth, a sign, paradoxically, of their elite status. Among courtiers, black teeth became a strange mark of fashion. Some even darkened their own teeth artificially to imitate the Queen, painted on tiny smudges of coal or lead-based pigment. It was the Tudor version of cosmetic dentistry, not to enhance beauty, but to emulate royal decay. For Elizabeth, the price of this indulgence was steep. By her late 40s, she had begun to lose teeth. Reports mention her speaking less clearly, holding her mouth tightly closed when not speaking, and developing a preference for soft, mashed foods. Meat was finely minced, fruit was stewed, and anything requiring forceful chewing was avoided. Her cooks adapted her meals to her changing needs. Her speechwriters took note of her breath. Her portrait painters avoided open smiles. One Spanish ambassador, after an audience, remarked that Elizabeth's teeth were very yellow and unequal, and that she spat often when she spoke. It was an unflattering observation, and a rare moment of candor in a court obsessed with silence and preservation. That foreign diplomats noticed it at all suggests how advanced the deterioration had become, and yet within England, few dared comment. To insult the Queen's appearance was to risk disgrace, and besides, many of her nobles suffered similar dental fates. They understood, they sympathized, they were complicit. Behind closed doors, Elizabeth likely suffered. Dental pain is relentless, a throb that travels into the skull, behind the eyes, down the jawline. It causes migraines, fevers, sleepless nights, and with limited remedies at her disposal, the Queen endured it in silence. At times, she may have self-medicated with opiates or strong wines. She may have relied on clove oil pressed to the gum with linen, but nothing could reverse the damage. As the years passed, her attendants adjusted. Her speech became softer, more calculated. Her meals were served warm and spoonable. She pressed scented handkerchiefs to her mouth, not just for scent, but as a barrier between herself and the world. In portraits, her lips were painted closed, always serene. In person, her mouth was guarded, a door that opened only when it had to. And so we return to the question, did Elizabeth still have her own mouth? Technically, yes. She never wore dentures in the modern sense. They did not yet exist in usable form. Crude replacements, made from ivory or animal bone, were known, but uncomfortable and often worse than the gaps they filled. If she had replacements, they were likely partial, ornamental, or temporary. But symbolically, the answer is more complicated. The mouth she presented to the world, perfumed, restrained, whispered, was no longer hers. It had been reshaped by decay, by politics, by expectation. Like everything else, it had become part of the act. And what lay behind that silent smile? Pain, certainly. Resentment, perhaps. But above all, resolve. Because Elizabeth knew that to let even her mouth falter was to invite doubt. And for a monarch built on performance, there could be no greater threat. In the next unfolding of her private world, we step beyond the body itself and into its surroundings, into the hidden rituals of waste and washing, of what it meant to be human in a palace where even the act of relieving oneself was wrapped in layers of control. Because if her mouth was carefully guarded, so too was everything that left her body, and what that says about her is as revealing as anything she ever said aloud. Sweetness in the courts of Elizabeth I was more than a taste. It was a declaration. Sugar wasn't just food. It was currency, status, indulgence, and power, all crushed into sparkling white crystals and sculpted into roses, castles, and crowns. The very presence of sugar at a feast was a performance, one that whispered of empires overseas and coffers overflowing. And at the center of this gilded excess sat the Queen, spooning sweetness into her mouth with the same precision she wielded over nations, and slowly, unknowingly, poisoning herself from within. In Elizabeth's time, sugar was still an exotic import, harvested in brutal conditions from plantations far across the sea. It arrived in barrels, laced with the scent of molasses, sold by the ounce like perfume or rare metal. Only the wealthiest could afford it regularly. It was used to preserve fruit, to coat almonds, to craft edible sculptures for royal banquets. For a monarch, to abstain would be to appear modest, and modesty was not a virtue Elizabeth could afford. She loved it, and she wasn't alone. Sweetmeats, candied violets, crystallized ginger, spiced cakes soaked in honey and clove. These were staples of the royal table. Meals in her court often ended with elaborate subtleties. Desserts shaped like animals or mythological scenes, all carved from sugar and dyed with natural pigments. They were too beautiful to eat, and yet always devoured. To taste sugar was to participate in imperial power. To serve it was to honor the crown. And the queen, ever aware of the message her choices conveyed, indulged with ceremony. But sugar's beauty was a mask, one as deceptive as her powdered face. Its effects were slow, quiet, and devastating. The constant exposure to sugar corroded Elizabeth's teeth. The enamel wore away, cavities burrowed deep. Infections took root in her gums. By her 50s, her mouth bore the cost of decades of indulgence. She could no longer chew certain foods, and the simple act of eating required orchestration, from preparation to plating to the careful positioning of spoons and goblets, so that no one would see how difficult it had become. Her physicians were powerless. Dentistry, as it existed then, was a grim practice of last resorts. No fillings, no anesthesia. If a tooth caused pain, it was yanked. If it bled, a poultice of crushed herbs and wine might be applied, followed by a prayer. In some cases, teeth were cauterized with hot instruments, a practice that left lasting damage to the jaw and nerves. Elizabeth, who had survived political purges and violent uprisings, now faced a quieter, more personal torment, the erosion of her ability to nourish herself without pain. But she endured it, silently. To admit the problem was to admit weakness, and so, instead, she adapted. Her cooks mashed meats into fine pâtés. Root vegetables were boiled to a softness that could be swallowed without chewing. Even apples were baked and spiced until they collapsed into fragrant pulp. No crusts, no bones, no crunch. Her diet shifted, not as a matter of preference, but of necessity. Her palate remained sweet, but now her desserts were softer, jellies, puddings, creams, gentle on the mouth, rich on the tongue, and deadly over time. She masked the pain with clove oil and infusions of chamomile. Sometimes she sipped wine laced with poppy or laudanum, especially during court festivities when speaking was required. Her voice, always measured, became softer in later years, not just from age, but from the physical strain of speech. Some courtiers noted she occasionally pressed her fingers to her jaw when deep in thought, as if grounding herself through the pain. Still, the sugar continued, not because she didn't know the cost, but because the cost had become part of her image. A queen who could afford pain was a queen who could not be broken. To abstain from sugar would have been to appear weak, reformed, even penitent, and Elizabeth could not be any of those things. She had built her persona on invincibility. Just as she hid the damage to her skin with lead and the absence of hair with wigs, She buried the agony in her mouth behind painted lips and sugared words. The paradox was complete. The very substance that allowed her to appear powerful, the sugar that decorated her feasts, sweetened her breath, and defined her wealth, was eating away at her from the inside. And still, she smiled, at least when the portraits demanded it. In her private chambers, the story was different. There, away from the gold and the gazes, Elizabeth likely sat in silence, pressing cool cloths to her cheek or clutching a goblet of warm wine as distraction. Her attendants, trained in discretion, said nothing. Her physicians, bound by protocol, offered treatments that soothed little and cured nothing. And she, as always, endured. Because that's what Elizabeth did. She endured. But behind the banquet tables, behind the scent of rosewater and spice, the Queen of England was suffering. And as we peel back another layer of that suffering, we arrive at one of the most private and most revealing rituals of her daily life, the hidden, silent world of the royal toilet, a space few ever saw, a ritual never recorded in full, and yet, in its shadows, we find a portrait of a monarch more human and more vulnerable than the world was ever meant to see. There was one place in Elizabeth's world where ceremony met the body with no room for pretense, a place where no crown, no portrait, no perfumed glove could disguise the truth of flesh. The royal close stool, as it was delicately called, was the most unspoken seat in the realm. And yet, it sat not in some hidden corridor or servant's corner, but right there, in her private chambers, among the silks, the incense, and the portraits of ancestors. This object, so mundane and so intimate, reveals more about Elizabeth of yore than any throne ever could. The Queen's toilet, though that word had not yet evolved into modern usage, was not porcelain or plumbed. It was a wooden cabinet, carefully crafted and padded with velvet or leather, depending on the season. It opened like a chest or a chair, revealing a chamber pot below, often lined with pewter or brass, occasionally filled with sweet-smelling herbs or vinegar-soaked linen to dull the scent. This close stool was mobile. It could be moved to her bedside during the night, or placed near her dressing area for the morning routine. And it was not just functional, it was symbolic. Even in her most vulnerable state, the Queen of England sat upon a work of art, but she never sat there alone. Each visit to the close stool was overseen by one of the most powerful yet invisible figures in the royal household, the mistress of the robes, or more specifically, the groom of the stool, a position of absolute discretion and bizarre prestige. This person, often a noblewoman of impeccable standing, was tasked not just with cleaning, but with managing all bodily related rituals. She tracked the Queen's rhythms, her appetite, her digestion, her discomforts, and through this proximity, she often became one of the Queen's closest confidants, privy not only to the physical, but to the emotional currents of her monarch's life. In the morning, before Elizabeth's transformation began, before the corset was tightened, the ceruse applied, the jewels clasped at the throat, this ritual of release and recovery took place. Her chamber was warmed, scented with dried herbs or burning cedar. The close stool was brought out discreetly, respectfully, as attendants turned their eyes elsewhere. The Queen sat, and the woman responsible stood silently by, ready with a cloth soaked in rosewater or orange blossom, used not for washing, but for dabbing, freshening, masking. There was no flushing, no running water. The contents of the chamber pot were carried out by servants trained not just in removal, but in reverence. The air was refreshed with sachets of dried lavender and rosemary. Ashes from the fireplace were sometimes scattered near the stool to absorb lingering odor. And when the ritual ended, the queen was redraped as if nothing had happened. No record kept, no words spoken. This was Elizabeth's most private space, and paradoxically, one of her most regulated. She could not go unaccompanied. She could not relieve herself without the orchestration of others. Even in this, she was never alone, and yet she was always isolated. The irony is deep. The woman who held all of England in the palm of her hand could not even empty her own bladder in peace. Her body was state property, its rhythms, its failings, its silences, all carefully observed, never discussed. If she lingered too long, it was noted. If she cried out in discomfort, it echoed through silent corridors, but no one dared write it down. And what of when she was unwell? Illness changed everything. When the Queen suffered digestive troubles, which she surely did given her restrictive diet, her medications laced with mercury, and the immense stress of rule, the rituals became more complicated. The close stool had to be kept near constantly. Her ladies would have had to monitor her fluid intake, her pain levels, her appetite. Remedies were offered: herbal teas, crushed rhubarb root, infusions of fennel or mint. But if the Queen was bedridden, every action had to be carried out in the confines of her bed, a violation of privacy that no amount of velvet could soften. And still, no one spoke. They had learned long ago that the Queen's strength was in the appearance of control. To draw attention to the natural betrayals of the body, a spasm, a cramp, a moment of dizziness, was to threaten the illusion. So even in sickness, Elizabeth remained wrapped in fabric, guarded by silence, and served by those who had mastered the art of disappearing into the background. There is something haunting in this paradox. The more powerful she became, the more exposed she was. The more worshipped, the more watched. Every breath was monitored, every ache noticed, but never acknowledged. Her most human moments were reduced to ritual, and ritual erased meaning. We do not have detailed descriptions of Elizabeth's close stool. There are no sketches, no inventories that name it directly. And yet, it existed. It stood beside the bed of a woman whose name would outlive every marble monument built in her honor. And it reminds us, more than any crown or scepter ever could, that behind the power was a body, stubborn, aging, secretive, suffering, and that body needed relief, however carefully choreographed. In the next breath of her story, we leave behind the chamber pot and step into the world of her attendants, the silent women who hovered near, who witnessed everything, and who carried her secrets like relics. Because what the Queen could not allow the world to see, these women saw every day and chose to keep it hidden. They hovered like shadows, always present, never seen. The Queen's ladies, her maids, her chamberers and mistresses of the wardrobe were more than servants. They were witnesses, silent guardians of illusion. To serve Elizabeth, I was not merely an honor. It was an initiation into a life of curated reality, where truth was filtered through layers of etiquette and silence. These women stood closer to her than any general, any counselor, any bishop. They dressed her, perfumed her, wiped her skin, bandaged her wounds, adjusted her wigs, and knelt beside her at the closed stool. And yet, not one of them ever left a detailed account of what they truly saw. That silence was not born of discretion alone, it was survival. There was an unwritten code among the Queen's inner circle, a covenant not of paper or oath, but of glances, small habits, generations of example. You did not speak of her body. You did not speak of its odors, its blemishes, its tremors. If a sore bled through the powder, you dabbed it with rosewater and said nothing. If the scent beneath her corset turned sour from heat and age, you lit another bundle of herbs and carried on. If her teeth ached so badly she could barely chew, you prepared the food more softly and poured her wine a little warmer. And if she clutched the arm of a chair in pain, you simply steadied it. These women were trained in invisibility. Their movements were rehearsed, their faces impassive. To flinch, to wrinkle a nose, to react, even slightly, was a punishable offense. Elizabeth did not tolerate reminders of her mortality. She could endure pain, she could endure betrayal, but she could not endure pity. So the ladies watched in silence as her skin changed, as her moods sharpened, as her body, beneath all its splendor, sagged and broke in private. And they said nothing. Many of these women were of noble birth. They served not for wages, but for proximity to power. Their families used them as eyes and ears in the Queen's private world. But once inside, these women became something else, keepers of secrets, too delicate to ever reach the ear of a husband or courtier. And those who could not bear the weight of what they saw, they did not stay long. There were stories, whispered only years after Elizabeth's passing, of young maids who fled court life, not because they were dismissed, but because they had seen too much. One tale spoke of a girl from Norfolk, barely 17, who fainted upon seeing the Queen's face without makeup and never returned to service. Another mentioned a laundress who asked too many questions about the linens and was quietly sent back to her village with a small purse and a warning. No charges, no scandal, just vanishing. The Queen herself cultivated this reverence. She rewarded loyalty with jewels, with titles, with closeness. But she also made it clear, to witness was not permission to remember. What happened inside her chambers stayed locked there, not just in walls, but in the minds of those entrusted to move silently within them. Nowhere was this illusion more fiercely guarded than in her wardrobe. To dress Elizabeth was to enter a labyrinth of silk, velvet, whalebone, lace, and fur, a fortress of fabric designed not only to dazzle, but to contain. Her gowns were masterpieces, often weighing upwards of 20 or even 30 pounds, layered from the ground up like armor. A chemise came first, then a corset laced so tightly it altered her breathing. Petticoats, farthingales, underskirts, bodices, sleeves, overskirts, ruffs, each one fastened, pinned, adjusted by multiple hands, working in synchronized choreography. But beneath the spectacle, the garments were prisons. They trapped heat. They trapped sweat. They trapped the residue of powders, ointments, and oils pressed into her skin each morning. And once worn, they were rarely washed. Fabric was expensive, delicate, and, in the Tudor mindset, vulnerable to damage by water. Instead of laundering, the Queen's gowns were aired, hung in open windows, or perfumed with sachets of herbs. Dust was beaten out with padded sticks. Linings might be replaced, but the garment itself remained. As the years passed, The dresses absorbed her scent. Not just the sweet overlay of rose and musk, but the deeper, truer odors of the body: fatigue, tension, illness. They were her second skin, and like her real one, they were cracking. The weight was constant. When standing in full regalia, Elizabeth relied on her posture, her will, and her lady's silent support. If she leaned too long in one direction, the corset might bruise. If the weather turned warm, the silk became suffocating. In moments of privacy, she sometimes asked for looser lacing, for lighter fabrics. But such requests were rare. She understood the cost of compromise. A queen who appeared soft invited questions, and Elizabeth invited none. Even her shoes were designed more for status than comfort. Narrow, often heeled, and elaborately embroidered, they pinched, they blistered, and still she walked, because a queen does not limp. The ritual of dressing could take hours, not because Elizabeth demanded opulence for its own sake, but because each garment was another layer between her and the world, a barrier of silk and structure to hold in the body, to hold back time, to hold off doubt. And when the day ended, those same ladies would help her peel it all away, slowly, carefully, without comment. What they saw in those hours, the red welts from corset bones, the powdered patches beneath her arms, the way her shoulders hunched with exhaustion, they carried with them in silence, because to speak of what lay beneath the gown was to violate the myth. And Elizabeth's myth was sacred, but even myths stain. And while the queen's clothing may have dazzled in the eyes of ambassadors and artists, for those who carried it, folded it, lifted its weight from her trembling frame, it told a different story. One of burden, of concealment, of a woman armored not in steel, but in silence. And as we move forward in her story, we ask the question so few dared speak aloud. What happened to these garments once they could no longer carry the illusion? Where did the fabric go when it had absorbed too much? How did the queen, who never stopped performing, discard the costumes of a role she could never truly escape? The queen's gowns, for all their brilliance, were not eternal. They sagged with time, dulled with wear, and drank deeply of the scent of the woman who lived inside them. Yet they were not scrubbed. They were not boiled, soaked, or lathered with soap. In Elizabeth the Virge's court, the idea of washing such garments was not only impractical, it was unthinkable. To the Tudor mind, washing fine clothes with water wasn't cleansing. It was a form of destruction. And so, the wardrobe of a monarch was not a cycle of cleaning, but a ritual of avoidance. The materials used in Elizabeth's dresses, silks from Italy, velvets from Flanders, gold-threaded damasks, hand-embroidered bodices, were as delicate as they were extravagant. These fabrics, especially once stiffened with whalebone or lined with fur, could warp or decay if soaked. Water, especially in its cold and often impure state, was seen not just as damaging, but as dangerous. It could discolor dyes. It could loosen seams. Worse still, it could open the fabric, much as people believed it opened skin, to bad airs. So what was the solution? Air, open windows, gentle breezes, sunlight. After a day of use, Elizabeth's dresses were not sent to a laundress, but to the airing chamber, a space designated for hanging clothes out to breathe. There, under the supervision of trusted wardrobe keepers, the queen's gowns were suspended on wooden racks or padded forms. Sachets of lavender, rosemary, or dried orange peel or tucked into the folds. The garments were gently shaken, then left to sit for hours, sometimes days. This, they believed, was enough. The air would do the washing. The herbs would do the purifying. Bodices that had absorbed sweat were turned inside out and brushed. Fur trims were dusted with special cloths. The inner linings of sleeves, where powder, oils, and warmth collected, were blotted with linen, never wet, and perfumed. If an underlayer was too heavily stained or stiffened with residue, it might be discreetly removed and replaced. But the outer shell, the visible masterpiece, remained untouched by water. Even linen, used for shifts and undergarments, was treated carefully. Though it could be washed more aggressively than silk, it was still not scrubbed in the modern sense. Laundresses prepared ash-based soap, boiled water with herbs, and used wooden paddles to press the fabric rather than beat it. Rinsed items were dried in the open air, but never fully wrung out to prevent stretching. Some were even ironed with hot stones, wrapped in cloth to restore shape and remove wrinkles without scalding the fibers. But not everything could be revived this way. Some gowns, worn too often or damaged by unseen spills or age, began to carry a smell, a combination of old perfume, skin oil, mildew, and thyme. This scent, though disguised with herbs and incense, lingered like a ghost. It was the smell of labor and luxury, of long nights and long rains, of a woman performing power with a body fighting beneath it. And nowhere was that scent more concentrated than in the Queen's bedchamber. Despite its grandeur, the royal bedroom was, at its heart, a deeply human space. The bed, though canopied and gilded, was lined with layers of wool-stuffed mattresses, velvet hangings, and heavy blankets. The air inside grew thick, especially in winter, when fires were stoked high and windows sealed against the cold. On the floor, rushes mixed with dried herbs softened the stone, but also trapped debris, spilled powders, fallen food, broken strands of hair, fragments of herbs and fur, all blended together into a low, musky scent. Servants did what they could. They swept with branches of thyme or hyssop. They changed the herb-stuffed rushes regularly. They aired the Queen's sheets and burned incense after she had risen. But the combination of seldom washed garments, perfumed cloths, and a body that rarely met water made for an aroma that no amount of rosewater could fully erase. The Queen herself, surrounded by these familiar smells, likely ceased to notice them. Like a musician who no longer hears the hum of the lute, she moved through the haze of her own ritual as if it were air. Perhaps in some way it was comforting, a scent not of filth, but of identity, her life, her reign. But to an outsider, especially one unaccustomed to the closed, scented chambers of power, the smell of the Queen's room might have been overwhelming. The mixture of powder and perspiration, perfume and damp fur, herbs and aging fabric was not unpleasant in a single note, but in concert it was heavy, stubborn, unmistakably human, and still no one dared speak of it. To comment on the Queen's chamber was to trespass. To hint that the Virgin Queen's bedroom smelled less like sanctity and more like secrecy was unthinkable. So silence hung in the air, thicker than the incense, longer lasting than the garments themselves. Which leads us to the question her servants never asked aloud, but knew in every action. How long can a scent be disguised before it begins to define you? In the next breath of her story, we step outside the Queen's chamber and into the broader court, a world where scent itself was power, and where everyone, from nobleman to ambassador, had learned to breathe shallow and speak of nothing they sensed. Because at Elizabeth's court, the illusion was not just what you saw, it was what you dared not smell. To understand the court of Elizabeth I, one must first discard the modern nose. The Tudor court was a world of scent, not in the way we imagine fragrant soap or fresh linen, but a rich, entangled blend of body, herbs, incense, dust, sweat, candle wax, and sweet decay. It was not unpleasant to its inhabitants. It was life. It was the smell of proximity to power, of rooms that never emptied, of clothes that never met water. And in this world, the line between odor and identity was blurred. The people of Elizabeth's time lived much closer to the body than we do. They slept near hearths, worked beside animals, and walked streets where refuse, chamber pot contents, and butcher's waste spilled freely. Their noses were not dulled, quite the opposite. They were trained over time to read scent as information, not offense. A sharpness beneath someone's clothes might mean stress or illness. A sour note in a hall might suggest mold, poor ventilation, or unclean rushes. But none of this provoked disgust. It simply was. The Queen's court was no exception. Despite the silk gowns and powdered faces, despite the perfume and gilded rituals, it too existed in the same sensory world. Her courtiers, many of whom rarely bathed themselves, were not shocked by the musky scent of unwashed linen or the sickly sweet trail of overused perfume. They did not recoil at the smell of flesh beneath a corset. In fact, to smell strongly of anything, rose, musk, sweat, wine, was often considered a mark of vitality or wealth. So when Elizabeth walked through the hall, trailing a complex fragrance of oils, powders, flesh, and silk, it was not a scandal. It was theater. Her scent preceded her like a royal announcement. And those who caught it, even those who noticed the darker notes beneath the lavender and civet, knew better than to comment. But still, some noticed. Foreign ambassadors, often unused to England's particular sensory culture, occasionally hinted in their writings at the density of the air in court. One remarked on how the Queen's chamber is rich with incense and oils, yet stirs the breath with something older. Another described the throne room as perfumed and thick, like a chapel left closed too long. These were subtle observations, shielded in metaphor, because to directly mention the Queen's physical scent would have been unthinkable, dangerous, yet her subjects rarely questioned it, because to question the Queen's body, its odors, its needs, its cycles, would be to puncture the myth that held the kingdom together. And nowhere was that silence more profound than in the realm of women's hygiene. Menstruation in Elizabeth's court was not a topic of open conversation, not among men, and not even among women. It was a private matter, cloaked in euphemism and ritual. The Queen, as the embodiment of purity and control, could not be seen as subject to her body. And yet, like every woman, she lived with its rhythms. She bled, she cramped, she endured the fatigue, the discomfort, the shifts in mood, but never, not once, is it mentioned in official record. Her ladies knew, of course, the Queen's body was their domain. They observed the stains, prepared the cloths, managed the discomfort with practiced silence. In place of modern hygiene products, Elizabeth likely used folded cloths, soft linen pads secured with ties, or tucked into specialized undergarments. These were changed frequently, quietly, burned or washed and boiled when possible. They were stored in scented chests, handled with care, never discussed. Travel days and negotiations presented particular challenges. In a carriage, bouncing over uneven roads, there were no private rooms, no fixed wash basins. On diplomatic missions or progresses through the countryside, her ladies had to improvise, bringing with them all the tools of discretion: clean linen, aromatic sachets, warm cloths, and the absolute confidence that no moment of weakness would escape their circle. When the queen sat across from foreign kings or English bishops during such times, no sign betrayed her condition. Her gown remained crisp, her posture unshaken. The scent of civet or rose hung in the air, undisturbed, and if pain crept behind her eyes, she blinked it away without a word. The pressure to maintain this composure was immense. Elizabeth had no husband, no heir. She reigned as a woman in a world of men, a woman whose power was constantly scrutinized for any hint of fragility. To bleed visibly, to show discomfort, to excuse herself from courtly duty, all of it would have chipped away at the constructed persona of the ageless divine monarch. And so, she turned even this most natural function into ritual. Her attendants prepared for it like a military operation. Linens were packed and counted, perfumed waters readied, cushions arranged. If she seemed quieter on certain days, more reserved or sharp-tongued, those closest to her adjusted without acknowledgement. It was their job to create a seamless transition between the queen's internal world and her public presence, to make sure the body, however unpredictable, never intruded on the myth. What does this tell us? That Elizabeth's hygiene, or lack of it, was not carelessness. It was strategy, a performance not of cleanliness, but of control. She could not afford to be seen as vulnerable, mortal, female in the ways the world most feared. And so, every bodily function became a silent negotiation between reality and reign. But not all bodies can be controlled forever. And in the next turn of her story, we confront the dark edge of beauty itself, not what the queen hid beneath layers of silk or the silence of her maids, but what she rubbed into her skin with trembling hands, believing it would preserve her, because behind the glow of her face lay poisons more potent than politics, and their toll would be written not in scandal, but in skin. The scent of Elizabeth of Verona was unmistakable. It drifted through the palace like a signature, a royal seal in the air. Long after she passed through a chamber, it lingered, a complex blend of rose and civet, of orange blossom, ambergris, and something sharper, darker. Her fragrance was as calculated as her words, layered like her gowns, refined over decades of performance. But beneath the beauty, beneath the illusion of floral grace, there was danger, because Elizabeth's perfumes were not just scents, they were chemistry, and some of them, quite literally, were poison. Perfume in the Tudor era was not merely indulgence. It was protection. It was medicine. It was a mask against the rot of the world and against the rot of the body. Elizabeth lived in a time when disease was believed to travel through miasmas, bad air, invisible clouds of sickness that clung to crowded streets, unwashed garments, and human skin. To perfume oneself was not just to smell pleasant. It was to seal the body from these threats, to build an invisible fortress of fragrance. The queen used this logic to its fullest extent. Her favorites included distilled rosewater, oil of lavender, crushed myrtle leaves, cloves, and cinnamon. Her apothecaries prepared mixtures from imported flowers, jasmine from the Mediterranean, musk from the East, resin from the forests of Bohemia. These were blended with base oils, aged in glass, and dabbed behind her ears, along her neck, across her wrists, and inside her sleeves. But these oils were rarely pure. Distillation was primitive. Many blends included stabilizers, fixatives, or preserving agents. Substances like camphor, turpentine, or benzoin, which in large quantities could irritate the skin or lungs. Others contained mercury or arsenic in trace amounts, added because they were believed to invigorate the blood or preserve the flesh. Some perfumes, especially those meant for ceremonial wear, were infused with civet, a pungent substance scraped from the glands of a wild cat, thick, musky, and difficult to wash away. In the wrong concentration, it could cause nausea, but it lasted, and that made it valuable. Elizabeth had a particular fondness for sweet, spicy blends. She wore pomanders, hollow spheres of gold or silver filled with aromatic paste, on chains around her neck or sewn into her gowns. These held a mix of beeswax, clove, nutmeg, and occasionally powdered orris root, a substance that smelled like violets, but when overused could inflame the skin or respiratory tract. Her gloves were soaked in perfume so rich they left stains on her fingers. Her bed linens were dusted with powdered rose petals and calamus root, another potential irritant. The queen didn't simply apply perfume, she lived in it. Her rooms were scented with burning pastilles made of resins, spices, and powdered herbs. The walls were lined with sachets. Servants were instructed to fan rooms before her arrival, not only to clear the air but to spread fragrance. Her writing desk contained vials of scent, and her travel chests included backup bottles, sealed in velvet pouches, so she was never caught without her aromatic shield. It was more than a preference. It was a necessity. Elizabeth's body, subject to age, illness, and layers of unwashed clothing, needed to be concealed. Her skin, inflamed from lead and mercury-based makeup, often could not be washed clean. Her garments, heavy with sweat and history, exhaled their own stories. Perfume wasn't luxury, it was strategy. But it came with a cost. Many of the substances she used were cumulative toxins. Lead in her sarus, mercury in her skin creams, arsenic and turpentine in her perfumes. Alone, in trace amounts, each was tolerable, but together, over years, layered daily on the same skin, inhaled through the same breath, they became something more insidious, a silent enemy masked in petals. Symptoms of chronic exposure would have included skin irritation, memory loss, tremors, headaches, fatigue, and mood swings, all of which Elizabeth reportedly suffered from in her later years. She was known to become irritable, to forget names she once spoke with perfect command, to withdraw from her advisors, to fall into silences that unnerved even her closest companions. Her doctors blamed age. Her ladies said nothing, but the truth may have been clinging to her skin all along. Could her perfumes have killed her? Perhaps not directly. But they were certainly part of the larger assault, a slow poisoning of the body in pursuit of eternal youth, eternal power. The same hands that dabbed rosewater on her wrists also brushed mercury along her jawline. The same breath that inhaled the sweet oil of myrrh also drew in vapors of turpentine and civet, the same neck that bore pearls, and praise bore too the cost of vanity and myth. And yet, she continued, because to strip away the perfume would have been to allow the truth of the body to emerge, the sweat, the fatigues, the ache, and Elizabeth had no place in her court for any of those. She did not just wear scent, she became it. She became the sweet, spiced mirage her kingdom adored, even if it meant sacrificing the very body that made the illusion possible. But there was more to this than perfume, more to her purity than powders and oils. The Virgin Queen, for all her mastery of presentation, was also defined by what she denied: desire, intimacy, touch. And to understand the full scope of how her physical identity was constructed, we must explore how her rule twisted something as natural as the human body into a symbol of isolation and control. Because Elizabeth's hygiene was never just about cleanliness, it was about suppressing the body altogether, even when the body begged to be seen. The image was unshakable, the Virgin Queen untouched, untouchable, radiant not from flesh, but from myth. Elizabeth did not merely rule England, she embodied it. Her body was not her own, but the crown's. It was a symbol of stability in a time of unrest, a beacon of discipline in a world ruled by appetites. To remain unwed, to appear above desire, was not just a personal choice, it was a weapon, a mask sharper than any blade, more absolute than any army. But the cost of becoming an icon is the erasure of the human beneath. From the earliest days of her reign, Elizabeth leaned into the power of chastity. She declared herself married to England. Portraits positioned her hand on the globe, not a man's. Her court poets compared her to Diana, the virgin huntress, divine and distant. Her dresses became more elaborate, more armored, high collars, stiff bodices, sleeves like walls. Her very fashion reflected a body sealed off from temptation, from need, from nature. She wasn't to be desired, she was to be worshipped. And worship demanded denial. Sexuality, in the context of a female monarch, was dangerous. A queen who bore a child belonged to a dynasty. A queen who took a lover belonged to scandal. But a virgin, she belonged only to herself, and by extension, to the state. Elizabeth understood this. She wielded it masterfully. She flirted, but never committed. She showed affection, but never intimacy. Rumors swirled, as they always do, but no one ever proved what her private life truly contained, because no one was allowed inside. And so, her public persona began to consume her private body. Physical needs became political vulnerabilities. She suppressed them, she concealed them, she transformed them into performance. Her appetite was controlled. Her illnesses were hidden. Her bleeding was erased through silence. Her aging, her fatigue, her loneliness, all covered with powder and pearls. Even something as natural as sweat was reframed as indecent. Her body, dressed in layers, perfumed beyond recognition, was trained to remain still, controlled, composed. Her attendants, aware of this performance, adjusted the room temperature, timed her appearances, managed her exposure to light, heat, and pressure. If she perspired, the evidence was wiped away before it was acknowledged. And so the question lingers. What was Elizabeth's physical life really like? Behind the curtains, beneath the ruffs and the rhetoric, she was still a woman made of blood and breath. She suffered from migraines, dental pain, hormonal fluctuations. She experienced the tremors of age, the changes of the body, the tightness in her chest from corsets drawn too hard. She felt heat, cold, hunger, fear, but every sensation had to be swallowed, every reaction mastered. Her body was a battlefield, and her strategy was suppression. This ethos didn't end with her. It infected the entire court. Courtiers began to mirror her behavior, not out of admiration, but necessity. To gain favor, one had to reflect the queen's ideals, to become a fragment of her myth. And so, the court itself began to abandon water, to favor perfume over cleanliness, ritual over reality. The nobility, once fond of baths and ointments, now began to see washing as a sign of weakness. If the queen could endure weeks without bathing, so could they. If she wore the same gown, lightly aired but never scrubbed, they followed suit. Stagnation became elegance, scent became survival, and bodies, once animated and vibrant, became mannequins of self-denial. Some took it too far. There were those at court who, in their eagerness to embody the queen's ideal, pushed their own bodies into decay. Men who refused to wash for months. Women who slept in their gowns to maintain shape. Nobles who masked infections with herbs and bloodletting rather than admitting discomfort. Their loyalty to the queen's performance of restraint transformed into a grotesque mimicry. Teeth fell out, skin blistered beneath wigs, breath soured behind rose petal lozenges. And still, no one broke character. But the queen noticed. She knew who leaned too heavily into the performance, who turned myth into parody. There are quiet records of courtiers dismissed for neglecting the necessary. No scandal, no confrontation, just a quiet exile from favor. Because while Elizabeth demanded discipline, she detested excess, even in imitation. Politics, too, was shaped by this dynamic. Those who mastered the art of appearing composed, clean, silent, sweet-smelling, were favored. Those who let the body interrupt the image lost access. A man who sweated too visibly, who scratched at a sore in council, who whispered of illness, was seen not as human, but as weak. To be close to Elizabeth was to be like her, or at least to appear so. In this way, the Virgin Queen's obsession with bodily control rippled outward into policy, alliances, betrayals. Her court became a stage where every actor was trained to smell like power, even if they reeked beneath. And as we move forward, we return once again to the Queen herself, not the myth, but the woman. We enter the question her courtiers dared not ask, but which time eventually forced into view. Beneath all this performance, all this denial, all this dry, perfumed control, what happened when the queen could no longer hide the toll? When the layers cracked and her body, ever obedient, ever silenced, finally refused to play along? To the common people of Tudor England, the queen was not just distant in class, she was distant in scent. The lives of peasants, farmers, merchants, and servants were saturated with the tangible odors of survival. Their days began with the stoking of fires from damp wood, with the hauling of water from streams rich in silt and rot. They walked through streets littered with refuse, slept beside livestock, and wore garments passed down through generations, stiffened by sweat and smoke. Their bodies absorbed the world they lived in, earth and ash, dung, grease, and they wore these smells like invisible cloaks. And yet, when those same commoners were granted even a glimpse of their monarch during royal processions, court appearances, or public ceremonies. They often found themselves stunned not by her speech or her jewels, but by what they didn't smell. To them, Elizabeth smelled clean, or at least clean in comparison. The Queen's heavy perfumes, florals, spices, ambergris, musk were unlike anything a villager would ever encounter. The intensity of these scents, clinging to her gowns, her gloves, even her gloves' linings, created a sensory wall between monarch and subject. She didn't smell of firewood or sour linen. She smelled of somewhere else entirely, somewhere untouchable. This perceived cleanliness was part of the illusion. Elizabeth may have bathed rarely, may have layered powder over sweat, but to the common nose, dulled by a harsher environment, she seemed divine. Cleanliness, after all, was not a universal standard. It was a comparison. And next to the daily reality of a soot-covered laborer or a barefoot child, the Queen, cloaked in rosewater and myrrh, was as far removed as heaven from earth. This distance helped preserve her myth. For the peasantry, Elizabeth's scent reinforced her power, her mystique, her separateness. She wasn't one of them. She wasn't even close. But not everyone in her world was fooled. Among those who served her directly, or who engaged in prolonged political dealings, the illusion sometimes cracked, and when it did, it left behind quiet, damning traces in the margins of history. There were foreign ambassadors who, after long hours in her presence, wrote in careful but unmistakable tones. One from Spain described the Queen as radiant in dress, firm in voice, but cloaked in heavy fragrance to mask the effects of time. Another, more boldly, remarked that her breath carries the shadow of age, though none dare name it aloud. These were not insults. They were observations, slipped into coded dispatches, shielded by diplomacy. Medical notes, fragmentary, heavily filtered through court censorship, suggest that Elizabeth's physicians were aware of the toll her beauty rituals were taking. One referred to pustulae beneath powder, another to disturbance of humors manifest upon the skin. None dared mention odor directly, but their phrasing often circled around it. The air in the Queen's presence grows thick by evening, or scented linen laid again today per instruction. Even closer to the truth were the chambermaids, women who dressed her, undressed her, sat at the foot of her bed in the still hours of morning. Their voices do not survive in official records, but in second-hand accounts passed down later, we hear hints. A courtier, years after the Queen's passing, claimed that those who served her grace at night knew her as she truly was, scented, yes, but not without effort. Another wrote that the Queen's body required tending as a hothouse flower does, not because it bloomed, but because it might wither at any sign of chill or time. As Elizabeth aged, the tension between myth and body deepened. Her face, once powdered into serene stillness, now cracked more visibly beneath the layers. Her movements slowed, her voice thinned, her teeth, fewer and more brittle, shaped her speech in quieter, more measured phrases. Yet still the expectation remained to appear untouched. Some did notice, some whispered, but the myth held, not because it was impenetrable, but because people needed it to be true. Even those who saw the aging woman behind the mask chose to look away. To maintain the illusion was safer, easier, more comfortable than facing what lay beneath. And yet, one wonders, in those final years, when even her closest ladies struggled to manage the scent of unwashed linen, of old ointments, and decaying powders, did Elizabeth herself begin to feel the weight of the difference between who she was and who the world believed her to be. The truth, it seems, never surfaced fully, but it lingered like perfume in heavy air, never spoken, always sensed. And so we move closer to the quietest, most delicate question of all, not what Elizabeth wore, or painted, or perfumed, but what she became in those final days. When the mirror was turned to the wall, when even the illusion could no longer hold what was left of the woman who had spent a lifetime suppressing her body to sustain a throne. By the time Elizabeth reached her late 60s, the silence around her body had become almost absolute. What had once been whispers, the odd glance between maids, the quiet footnote in an ambassador's letter, had hardened into a wall. No one mentioned her breath. No one remarked on the stains beneath her ruff or the trembling of her hands. Even her doctors, once cautious truth-tellers, now shaped their reports into euphemisms. A change in temperament, a decline in appetite, a humoral imbalance. But within the Queen's private chambers, the truth grew harder to hide. Age had come for her, not quickly, not all at once, but in slow, undeniable erosion. Her skin, already damaged by decades of lead paint, now thinned to the point of tearing. Lesions developed along her jaw and neck, sometimes weeping beneath the makeup. Her limbs ached constantly, perhaps from arthritis, perhaps from the long-term effects of mercury. Her balance faltered, her eyes dimmed, her teeth, what remained of them, blackened further, some falling out completely. There are reports that she struggled to speak clearly in her final years, that her meals became more liquid than solid. Soft breads, broths, spiced wines, anything that could be swallowed without chewing. Her tongue, they said, often seemed swollen. Her breath, once masked by cloves and sweet herbs, had become bitter and metallic, but no one dared say so aloud. The most persistent change, however, was scent. Elizabeth had built her reign on fragrance, on masking, concealing, seducing through scent. But now, in old age, even her legendary arsenal of perfumes could not keep up. The powders curdled against her skin, the oils turned sour. Her corsets, worn for structure but rarely cleaned, held onto odors that even the strongest tinctures couldn't erase. Her bedding, though aired, could not fully shed the trace of illness. There were reports of bowel irregularities, of cramping and restlessness. At night, she sometimes called out, not for pain relief, but for linen. More linen. More rosewater. More silence. By then, she had all but shut the world out. She held no formal audience for days at a time. Mirrors were removed from her rooms. Even her closest attendants were instructed to speak less, to keep their eyes down. She had become her own prisoner, the monarch of a realm of gauze, shadow, and memory. The woman who once stood as a symbol of England's resilience now could barely rise from bed, and still she refused to show it. When visitors came, she forced herself upright, demanded her full regalia, ordered her face painted to the edge of cracking. They say her final appearances were almost ghostly, the color too stark, the posture too rigid, the smile too empty. But the illusion held, until, at last, it didn't. Elizabeth died in 1603, at the age of 69. She left no heir, no farewell speech, no confessional diary. Her last words were not recorded with certainty. What followed was a flurry of controlled panic. The Queen was gone. The body remained. And for the first time in decades, those closest to her had to face it directly. Her body was in poor condition. The embalming process, overseen by royal physicians and guarded from prying eyes, was treated with extreme delicacy. The usual methods, evisceration, salting, stuffing the cavities with herbs, were complicated by the state of her skin, fragile, bruised, perhaps even ulcerated in places. Her gums had long receded. Her jaw, according to some whispers, had sunken inward. Those who prepared her for burial worked quickly and silently. The linens were changed, the oils reapplied. The coffin sealed sooner than expected. Nothing was publicly disclosed. The official line, as always, preserved the myth. The Virgin Queen had passed peacefully, serene, untouched by pain, surrounded by her most loyal servants. Her body was placed in a lead-lined coffin, her image immortalized in marble. Her people mourned a symbol, not a woman. But among those who had seen the final hours, who had stood in the thick air of her last days, there was no forgetting. They had seen what lay beneath the years of perfume and powder, and they knew, in the deepest corners of their silence, that the truth had never matched the myth. And yet, they didn't speak, because by then, the myth had become bigger than any one truth, bigger than illness, bigger than decay. Elizabeth had built her legend from restraint, from denial, from transforming every natural flaw into a badge of power. Her very refusal to admit the body made her seem immortal, and for a fractured, uncertain England, that illusion had been a balm. The irony is sharp. The queen who represented cleanliness never truly washed. The monarch who symbolized purity lived layered in filth and scent and disease. The icon of restraint masked pain with indulgence. And yet, she ruled. She ruled for 44 years. She ruled without being touched, without being broken. So we must ask, why did the illusion work? Why do we still cling to it? Because we need to. We need our icons to be unchanging. We need our history to shimmer. We want our queens perfect and powdered, not aching and afraid. Elizabeth knew that. She gave us what we needed, a woman who overcame mortality by refusing to acknowledge it. And in doing so, she became something more powerful than clean. She became eternal.